Elijah Anderson was born in 1943, the middle child of 5 in a desperately poor Mississippi Delta family. The family moved to South Bend, Indiana while Elijah was still small, where he grew up and eventually completed an undergraduate degree in sociology at Indiana University. He got his master's degree in 1972 from the University of Chicago, the same place that produced Louis Wirth and later William Kornhauser, and earned his PhD in 1976 from Northwestern University. At the time, he was already teaching at Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania while writing his dissertation. In fact, he advanced from Swarthmore to the University of Pennsylvania in 1975, also before he had completed his doctoral degree, and began 3 decades of intensive study of poor, segregated neighborhoods in Philadelphia. He has published many articles and books, but this cover article from the Atlantic Monthly in 1994 may be one of his most well-known. In it, he outlines what he calls the Code of the Street, an excellent example of the subculture of poverty theory of group life, here with a twist that specifies not only poverty as an economic context, but adds residential segregation and the flight of jobs to the suburbs. All these conditions combine to produce a whole web of rules for public behavior that Anderson shows to be oppositional to the social world outside and self-destructive for the young people caught up in it. The article also illustrates Claude Fisher's idea that entirely new forms of social organization form into subcultures, collide, and compete within the urban social world. Long and painstaking efforts to gain access to and credibility with the young men and women in some of Philadelphia's poorest and most segregated neighborhoods, Elijah Anderson wrote down some of his observations for this Atlantic Monthly article. A few years later, he developed the topic in more detail in a full-length book with the same title as his article, The Code of the Street. A subculture is defined above all by the subjective values and attitudes of its members, which then are reflected in their everyday actions. The code he mentions in his title is a description of such a subculture. His article is not only about what values and attitudes make up this code, but how it is produced and maintained in the lives of its followers. All the details of the Code of the Street revolve around one central concept, an idea that shapes everything else. That concept is respect, the elusive goal that Otis Redding wrote a song about and that Aretha Franklin made even more famous when she sang it. More specifically, getting respect from other people becomes such a problem in the community studied by Anderson that it moves to center stage as an ever-present challenge, a goal that must be satisfied before almost any other goal in life can be considered or pursued. Without respect, other aspects of achievement, happiness, and even a sense of safety and security are threatened. Respect so problematic for these communities. Anderson roots the source of the problem in something very like the idea of urban anomie, which is not surprising since he also studied at Chicago and proudly considers himself as working in the tradition of Louis Wirth. He describes people in these neighborhoods as feeling powerless, at the mercy of a larger urban world. Quote, "In the troublesome public environment of the inner city, as people increasingly feel buffeted by forces beyond their control, what one deserves in the way of respect becomes more and more problematic and uncertain." Unquote. It is important to recognize, however, that he does not simply continue the original idea of Wirth that primary groups are swept away in the city and replaced by impersonal secondary ties. He has a much more personalized interpretation of the problem. For him, it is not about the loss of contacts with other people, but the loss of opportunities for action and achievement that can bring status and rewards of both material and intangible nature to people. Quote, "This outlook reflects the circumscribed opportunities of the inner city poor. Generally, people outside the ghetto have other ways of gaining status and regard, and thus do not feel so dependent on such physical displays." Unquote. If the Code of the Street originates in a frustrated quest for status and respect, we need to step back for a moment and understand the wider picture of what makes people respected in American society generally. There is a long tradition of social research into what kinds of status characteristics translate into respect for the people who possess them. While some aspects of respect are purely physical, such as personal strength and beauty, athletic ability, and the like, many of the most important carriers of high status and respect are socially defined and transmitted characteristics, such as occupations, educational attainment, residential location, and above all, income and accumulated wealth. It may be distasteful to admit it, but in the contemporary United States, you are what you do. To do nothing is to be nothing. To do little is to be little. And what you do is measured, in an increasingly mass society, largely by impersonal and objective financial measures. For example, studies that collect consensus measures of the prestige or status of people in the United States routinely find that the most respect goes to people who not only are extremely wealthy, but whose families have been extremely wealthy for a very long time. The longer, the better. It is difficult to come up with a list of these people individually, because in a society that publicly celebrates merit, personal effort, and individual achievement, the inheritance of vast wealth is a highly inconvenient violation of many of our most cherished national values. The highest status Americans live in a little subculture of their own, where respect is never an issue that could provoke a code of the street. Thus, the children of the political and economic elite typically live within their own rather closed world of elite prep schools and colleges, where they can meet each other, learn all the details of thought and behavior necessary to fit into this elite subculture, and eventually pair off with each other to keep the wealth collectively in their families. Most people are familiar with the Ivy League as a group of extremely expensive elite private colleges, mostly in the oldest northeastern region of the United States, where each new generation of this subculture makes its transition to adulthood and receives the baton of privilege, wealth, and power from a parental generation. The process starts much earlier in life, however. For example, Barack Obama attended the elite Punahou private school in Hawaii, and his daughters attended the even more elite Sidwell Friends private school in Washington, D.C., as did Chelsea Clinton before them. These places, however, are not even the pinnacle of this elite subculture. The Ivy League of high schools, feeding the children of the elite into the Ivy League colleges, is rooted in the 8-school association of private prep schools, again, all in the old money northeastern states of the country. Most ordinary Americans have never heard of these schools, and generally they and their students and alumni like it that way. It is easier to maintain continuity of privilege and power outside the spotlight of media attention in a mass society. The people who travel in this circle never need to worry about respect. They have it as a birthright, and after enough years in training, they all know it in their hearts. So how does a person achieve respect if they do not happen to travel in these elite circles? The vast middle classes of a mass society see only the outward trappings and the consequences of elite privilege, rarely glimpsing the process by which it is created and sustained. Predictably, then, most people try to gain respect by imitating the elites. The right education, the right job, the right house in the right neighborhood, or possibly even the right clothes or the right car can become badges of respect. An amazing shift in styles of the most expensive wedding dresses swept over the bridal industry after the royal wedding in England of Prince William and Kate Middleton. In mainstream American society, then, prestige and respect take their cues from the most well-established, the most wealthy and successful people. The ability to live as these people choose to do, whether it involves schools or jobs or private homes, becomes a measure of status and respect. Imitation really is the sincerest form of flattery. But there's a built-in tension in such an imitative system of status and respect. The further you get from the top of this system, the more impossible these goals become. When you reach the streets and neighborhoods studied by Elijah Anderson, pretty much everything from the mainstream world of status and respectability is simply beyond your reach. When people's dreams and goals are almost totally denied and frustrated, Anderson says, a very different, high-risk alternative may look increasingly attractive. Make up your own new rules and symbols for respect and status, and base them on something you actually can achieve, or at least that you think you can achieve. At the bottom of the social ladder, where the status markers of a society's elite are simply not available, what options are left? Anderson describes many details of what he calls street culture, but the root idea behind all of these details is very simple. People who have no access to elite schools, elite neighborhoods, high-status occupations, and the best of everything simply can't compete for such mainstream symbols of success. Lacking all these other symbolic and material resources, all the people in street culture have is each other. Even though you don't possess any of the mainstream markers of status and respectability, you must find a way to get respect from the people around you. If you can't show them the conventional markers recognized in the mainstream society, you must force them to respect you, or at least force them to behave in ways that outwardly look like respect. Unfortunately, this makes every encounter you have with other people a contest. Life on the street becomes what Thomas Hobbes back in 1651 famously called a war of all against all, a situation in which Hobbes said that every man's hand is raised against his neighbor and life tends to be nasty, brutish, and short. He wasn't writing about street culture, but his description fits pretty well. Anderson sums up this result. Quote, "The extent to which one person can raise himself up depends on his ability to put another person down." Unquote. If the only way to get respect is to take it from other people by sheer force of your own personal presence and behavior, Anderson thinks it is only a short step to thinking about respect as a kind of material commodity. The only place to get this commodity is from the other people around you, and like any commodity, there is only a certain amount of it available, a fixed supply. Quote, "There is a generalized sense that very little respect is to be had, and therefore everyone competes to get what affirmation he can of the little that is available." Unquote. The very serious problem with this way of looking at the world is that it creates what is called in the abstract a zero-sum game, a contest in which the amount of a resource that comes out of the game equals the amount that went into the game, and the game itself only redistributes this resource among the players. The game of poker is a zero-sum game. The 100-meter dash is a zero-sum game. The only way to win such a game is to make somebody else lose the game. There are other kinds of games, of course, but Anderson clearly identifies the code of the streets as a zero-sum game. To see the difference, we could view a basketball game between two teams as a zero-sum game. The only way for one team to win is for the other team to lose. Winners make losers. But if we look at the players on one of these teams, they are also playing a positive-sum game among themselves with each other. In a positive-sum game, if you play it right, more resources come out than went into the game. The whole can be more than the sum of its parts. The more the team members trust each other, cooperate, play as a team, and depend on each other, the more likely they are to win the larger zero-sum game. They all win or lose together. In this positive-sum game, winners make other winners. In the Code of the Street, Anderson describes a zero-sum game played by people who have little or no wealth, property, or other markers of status and success. They confront each other in the street and demand respect from each other. The only kind of power left in this situation is simple physical intimidation, the use of force, or as Anderson adds perceptively, the implied threat of the use of force. Sociologist Irving Goffman wrote a famous book entitled The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, concerned with the details of how people deliberately try to create public perceptions of themselves that produce the social outcomes they want. And it is exactly this kind of performance that Anderson finds at work in street culture. Above all, people must find ways to appear powerful and intimidating, to send a message that they are dangerous customers and that it would be a mistake to provoke any kind of confrontation. Surrounded by people who need to force you to give them at least the outward signs of respect, you must present yourself at all times on the street as a poor choice of target for such attempts to extract these signals. If you fail to present this kind of image, you're inviting other people to confront you, to engage in a face-off, a contest in which the winner gains respect and the loser, quite possibly you, becomes disrespected. Many features of the Code of the Street are designed simply to avoid these confrontations, to force the respect hunters to look past you to some other victim. This idea of respect as a prize to be won through personal confrontation, of status as a commodity in a zero-sum game, is not unique to a contemporary Code of the Streets. On the Great Plains, Native American tribes had a similar exercise that European observers translated as counting coup, using the French word coup for a physical blow or a strike. While these tribes could and did engage in savage, often lethal combat with each other, there was one mark of status that stood high above simply killing or wounding a warrior of a rival tribe. An incredibly brave warrior would attack his enemies carrying only a ceremonial stick, usually curved on one end and adorned with feathers and other totem objects. To ride unarmed into a ferocious battle, carrying only one of these sticks, to come face to face with a deadly opponent, and then to just hit him with this stick and then ride off again unharmed, was a demonstration of the ultimate physical courage. Someone who managed to count coup in this way would gain immense honor and prestige at home, and anyone struck by one of these sticks would be humiliated and branded as weak and incompetent. The trouble is that in the code of the streets, nobody is carrying a wooden stick adorned with feathers. Nobody's just counting coup. People have knives and guns. You're never more than an insult away from a potentially fatal confrontation. Your reputation as well as your own self-respect is constantly at risk of being snatched away from you on the street. No insult, no aggressive move can be tolerated, or it will lead to more and more of the same, eventually destroying your standing in the community. This war of all against all on the street is a problem in several ways, and Anderson singles out two of them to discuss in his article. First, he highlights the difficulty of maintaining a street persona in public places while still trying to live a life of harmony, affection, and mutual support in the privacy of a family's home. The decent families that he describes have to live in two worlds at the same time, always code switching between trying to live their private lives as a positive-sum game and surviving a life on the street played by zero-sum rules. Becoming an expert at such code switching can give people advantages even outside the street culture where it is practiced, but it is a stressful way to live and a source of potential confusion and frustration for the people practicing it. If you live in a neighborhood like those studied by Elijah Anderson, he claims that it doesn't matter whether you come from a decent family trying to hold together a life aimed at achieving mainstream social goals, or from a street family that has broken down under the pressures of poverty, joblessness, and segregation, ejecting each of its members into the lonely dog-eat-dog world of street culture. Either way, you have to know the rules of this subculture, and you have to be able to play by those rules every time you walk out the door. Anderson emphasizes the self-protective importance of this cultural knowledge. Quote, "When a person ventures outside, he must adopt the code, a kind of shield, really, to prevent others from messing with him," unquote. Going on inside your head, you have no choice except to present a no-nonsense image as your public persona when navigating the streets. This creates a strange and interesting question for Anderson. To what extent are the images of street culture, the graffiti centered on violence, the gangsta lyrics and music, the aggressive and profane tone of language, the accent on intimidation in clothing, tattoos, and other details of personal appearance, including even facial expressions, just a show being acted out by people following a script they have learned? Is street culture just acting, or have they internalized the code of the street so that they really believe everything they say and do? These alternative possibilities behind the surface images capture what he means by the difference between decent and street attitudes and actions. And he recognizes that a real person living in this social context may vibrate back and forth between these two possibilities. But one of these possibilities points to a very different future for people and for society than the other. To the extent that people not only act street, but come to believe and use the code of the street to understand their own identities and daily lives, Anderson recognizes that this code becomes an example of an oppositional subculture. This concept refers to a shared set of foundational beliefs about life that reject the norms and values of the surrounding society, and that seek to create a culture within a culture based on standards that in many ways are just the opposite of those in the larger society. There are many examples of oppositional subcultures, from pacifist groups who reject the idea of a duty to fight in wars to protect nation-states, to skinhead groups who follow doctrines of violence, racial superiority, and subordination, to countercultures oriented around unusual religious beliefs like the Amish, or unusual personal appearance like goths or punks, or groups who reject competitive free market capitalism in favor of collectivist ideas that lead them to live in communes. Anderson himself does not claim that the code of the street has gelled into a total comprehensive oppositional subculture in these neighborhoods. In fact, he clearly suggests that there are households on both sides of this issue throughout these communities. But for the people who come to believe in this code and to live it, both on the inside and on the outside, you might say, some very negative consequences follow from such a choice. First of all, of course, Anderson points out that there's a real chance that your pursuit of what he calls juice, or victory in the contest for respect, will simply get you killed in a violent confrontation. He is discouraged by how often this happens. But beyond this immediate danger, a hair-trigger obsession with respect and being disrespected can destroy your personal interactions with other people, both on the street itself and especially in the larger social world beyond it. Anderson remarks that people who don't have to live in such a situation will avoid even casual contact with people displaying such attitudes. Quote, "For people who live outside the inner city, the concern with respect in the most ordinary interactions can be frightening and incomprehensible," unquote. A complete streetwise act, including a specified style of dress, expression, language, and attitude, cuts you off from productive relationships with anybody who doesn't understand the code, who doesn't speak this subcultural language. It guarantees failure in mainstream job interviews. It makes other people avoid contact with you as much as possible, not only when you desire this result on the mean streets, but also when you might not want such a result on Main Street. Some scholars even have tried to apply this oppositional subculture argument in a wide range of settings beyond the streets of the neighborhoods where Anderson did his research. For example, some people have advanced this idea as an explanation for the achievement gap between different groups of school children, and especially the disastrous rates of school failure for young black males from poor, segregated neighborhoods. If some students have been captured by a subculture that rejects the values of mainstream society, they will deliberately reject school achievement even if they have the ability to succeed, because following the mainstream rules of the school would mean abandoning the code of the streets and turning your back on your oppositional subculture. Conformity and cooperation in the classroom could be seen as weakness, or even worse, as disrespecting your own group. Other sociologists, however, like Angel Harris from Princeton University, who can speak to this issue from his own experiences as a young black man, are skeptical of this explanation, both because empirical research doesn't find much support for the idea that subcultural values are causing students deliberately to reject learning, and because Anderson's description of the code of the street never suggested any such monolithic power for an oppositional culture. The existence of both decent and street families in these communities actually argues against such an interpretation. Anderson himself certainly never identified oppositional subculture as the main problem. He kept his eye firmly on the larger social and economic context that produces conditions of life leading to the code of the street. Quote, "The hopelessness and alienation many young inner-city black men and women feel, largely as a result of endemic joblessness and persistent racism, fuels the violence they engage in," unquote. Rather than a population totally swallowed up by a deviant urban subculture, Anderson's article shows us a population that must cope with a particularly hostile combination of circumstances in one corner of urban mass society, and a subculture that emerges as a coping mechanism in reaction to these circumstances. While some people are indeed totally submerged in this subculture, others among their neighbors reject its values even as they learn its zero-sum rules for surviving on the street outside their homes. Quote, "These decent people are trying hard to be part of the mainstream culture, but the racism that they encounter helps to legitimate the oppositional culture," unquote. Elijah Anderson describes a complex, confusing, challenging, fluid social environment, which illustrates both the power of subcultural attachments, as described by Claude Fisher, but also the power of large, depersonalized mass social transformation to put whole population groups in very difficult situations.